In the theater of war, he was the producer, director, and star. But brilliant military victories were overshadowed by crushing personal defeats.
He was forgetting what he had learned at West Point, that the commander-in-chief is the supreme commander.
The conclusion of MacArthur, tonight on American Experience. American Experience is made possible by the Alfred P. Sloan Foundation to enhance public understanding of the role of technology. The foundation also seeks to portray the lives of the men and women engaged in scientific and technological pursuit.
Liberty Mutual Insurance is a proud supporter of the American Experience. And by helping people live safer, more secure lives, we're also proud supporters of the American dream.
At the Scotts Company, we help make gardens more beautiful, lawns greener, trees taller. If there's a better business to be in, please let us know.
This program has been made possible by a grant from the National Endowment for the Humanities.
American Experience is also made possible by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting and contributions to your PBS station from viewers like you. Thank you.
For nearly 2 years, he had struggled through the jungles of New Guinea, fighting the Japanese and the war planners in Washington. Across oceans, in a bitter competition with the Navy, which he felt was out to thwart him. In April 1944, General Douglas MacArthur was about to launch his biggest battle since World War II began. He was destined, his parents had told him, to be a great man. At West Point, he had been first in his class. In World War I, America's most decorated soldier. But in 1942, he had presided over the biggest defeat in the history of the U.S. Army. The surrender of more than 70,000 American and Filipino troops on the Bataan Peninsula guarding Manila Bay and the island fortress of Corregidor. MacArthur's redemption lay in how quickly he could move across New Guinea and rescue the men he had left behind. When his troops sped toward Hollandia in Dutch New Guinea in April 1944, MacArthur was still 1,500 miles from his men, and they were suffering.
When somebody was accused of being a collaborator with the Americans, they would be given all kinds of torture in order to get from them any information that they might have with regard to the guerrilla forces.
I thought it was a Filipino, it was an American Indian. They beheaded the individual. They put his head on a pole. They walked up and down the main road in the camp so we could all see what happened to an escaped prisoner.
And early in the morning, they were brought to the Chinese cemetery in Manila, and they were beheaded right there. They were just told to kneel down in front of the holes where they're supposed to be buried, and with the Japanese samurai.
I leave, but I shall return. We all, those of us who admired him, always believed he would return.
I shall return. And we were always banking on his return. That's why we continued fighting.
MacArthur had told Philippine President Manuel Quezon, when he retreated to the States, that he would lead him back to Manila with his bayonets. Manila was MacArthur's spiritual home. He had lived there with his family for more than 6 years before the war, serving as Quezon's military advisor. His son, Arthur, spent his first 4 years in Manila. After they retreated to Australia, Arthur, age 5, asked his father, "When are we going back to Manila?" This was the question MacArthur asked the Joint Chiefs of Staff in Washington. He wanted to liberate Manila en route to Japan, but the decision was theirs, not his. In the spring of 1944, only Army Chief of Staff George Marshall supported him. Chief of Naval Operations Admiral Ernest King wanted a more direct route toward Japan. The Navy's new fleet of fast carriers was designed to sweep rapidly across the Pacific. MacArthur had counted on the support of the Army Air Force. Their new bomber, the B-29, came online in 1944, and they were eager to use it against Japan. The Navy, not MacArthur, could get them within bombing range. In March of 1944, the Air Force sided with the Navy. The chiefs ordered the Navy and Marines to take the Marianas Islands. From there, B-29s could reach Tokyo. The chiefs then favored a Navy push toward Formosa. Formosa would be a staging area for the invasion of Japan. MacArthur was appalled to learn that his New Guinea campaign would terminate in the southern Philippines, far from Luzon, where his men were suffering as prisoners of war. MacArthur could only count on a token return, not a heroic return as the liberator of Luzon.
The strategic decisions that are being made in the middle of 1944 are essentially going against MacArthur. It's frightening. It looks like his nightmare is going to be realized and not his dream.
The Joint Chiefs of Staff, however, leaves a loophole for MacArthur. They say that it might be necessary for MacArthur to seize parts of Luzon, which is really the heart of the Philippines. MacArthur will use this little loophole to press for a Philippines campaign. MacArthur decides if he can get across New Guinea faster than the Navy can get across the Central Pacific, then he can reopen the debate somewhere down the line and persuade the Joint Chiefs of Staff to let him occupy all the Philippines, not just the southern Philippines.
MacArthur believed that Eisenhower and Marshall were against him in Europe, the Navy was against him in the Pacific, Roosevelt was a tool of the Navy and of Marshall. All of this led MacArthur to believe that only a political club would give him the power or leverage he needed to get the supplies, the attention, and strategic priorities which he thought were rightfully his.
MacArthur, we want you for president.
Congressman Albert Miller of Nebraska supported a MacArthur run for president against Franklin Roosevelt in 1944. Unless this New Deal can be stopped, Miller wrote MacArthur, our American way of life is forever doomed. I do unreservedly agree with the wisdom of your comments, MacArthur wrote back. When the correspondence became public in April, MacArthur appeared to many as disloyal to his commander-in-chief. To one observer, he was a rather pompous and ignorant ass. He was forced to deny his candidacy. MacArthur received another blow in June. The Joint Chiefs visited Normandy after General Eisenhower's successful D-Day landing. They wanted to speed up the Pacific War. George Marshall alone had stymied King's demand for bypassing the Philippines. Now he began to agree with Admiral King.
And Marshall begins to think about bypassing the Philippines and Formosa and going straight for the Japanese home islands. When his planners make clear that that cannot work, he will say Formosa is strategically a better option than the Philippines.
If the Philippines were to be bypassed, MacArthur cabled Marshall, he wanted to meet with the president. Marshall cabled back, "You are allowing personal feelings to override our great objective, which is the early conclusion of the war with Japan. You confuse bypassing with abandonment." He then ordered MacArthur to report to Honolulu on July 26th. The day after Democrats nominated Roosevelt for a fourth term that July, the president secretly boarded a cruiser and headed for Honolulu.
General MacArthur arrived at the dock where the cruiser Baltimore was tied up in an open car, which everybody knew belonged to the madam of the biggest whorehouse in Honolulu.
And then he very casually but smartly started walking aboard ship up the President's gangway, up the red-carpeted gangway, which no one else had used up to that point.
General MacArthur went up the gangway, stopped halfway, turned and waved to the crowd.
As though he had all the time in the world and no one was waiting for him. And then when the cheer died down, he continued on up the gangplank and boarded the ship.
"I guess you know what this conference is for," FDR said, annoyed MacArthur had kept him waiting for an hour. "No," MacArthur replied, "I am completely unprepared."
I mean, what a lot of nonsense. MacArthur wasn't prepared. He knew exactly what this was about. And he was all loaded for bear.
For 3 days, MacArthur and Roosevelt played politics. FDR's agenda came first. He toured military installations with Admiral of the Pacific Fleet, Chester Nimitz, and America's favorite general, a prominent Republican.
There's nobody in the Navy who shares MacArthur's prestige. I mean, yes, Nimitz is important, and Admiral King is important, and Admiral Halsey is important, but no one has the prestige and standing that Douglas MacArthur does. And Roosevelt identifies himself with MacArthur. Again, he's taming him. He's using him. He's going to disarm conservative mood and attitude and feeling in the United States.
MacArthur's turn came after supper, when they discussed the next step in the war against Japan. Admiral Nimitz made the case for attacking Formosa. MacArthur stressed America's moral obligation to liberate the Philippines.
Well, MacArthur, the admiral said, he kept repeating, "I have promised the people of the Philippines that I will return. I have to keep my word. I cannot break the word." He said the United States would hate me if I didn't keep my word.
The next day after lunch, he managed to get 10 minutes alone with Roosevelt, and he made his strongest case, which was essentially a political pitch. He said, "Mr. President, you hope to be re-elected president. But the country would never forgive you if you left 17 million Christian American subjects to wither under the conqueror's heel until there is a peace treaty. Politically, it would ruin you.
He was leaving no question in Roosevelt's mind that if you bypass the Philippines, I am going to present a challenge to you politically. Not necessarily to run for the presidency against you, but to undermine your political standing with massive numbers of Americans who will see the betrayal that you, quote unquote, the betrayal that you're committing.
Douglas MacArthur and Franklin Roosevelt may well have struck a deal.
Both men came away convinced that MacArthur would not do anything politically disruptive before the presidential election, and Roosevelt would weigh in on the side of a plan to have a large-scale liberation of at least part of the Philippines, if not all.
Roosevelt wrote MacArthur saying he would push on that plan. There is no evidence he ever did. At the end of July, within days of their meeting, MacArthur's forces were at the western tip of New Guinea.
On August 1st, 1944, my father had the radio turned on to listen to the news. And the news came that the Americans had landed in an island 800 miles from the Philippines. And my father said, only 800 miles.
Manuel Quezon would never follow MacArthur's bayonets back to the Philippines. He died an hour later. On September 8th, the Joint Chiefs informed MacArthur he could advance to the island of Leyte in the central Philippines. They made no decision on what lay next, Luzon or Formosa. A week later, he landed on an island north of New Guinea, only 300 miles from the southern Philippines. He gazed out to sea, an aide recalled, as though he could glimpse through the clouds the rugged mountains of Bataan and the charred spine of Corregidor. They are waiting for me there, he said. It has been a long time. Just days before, planes from Navy carriers had bombed the southern Philippines, then Leyte, further north. They met little resistance. Admiral Halsey wired Admiral Nimitz in Honolulu, recommending an earlier landing at Leyte. Nimitz forwarded the cable to the Joint Chiefs, offering MacArthur the Navy's support. The Joint Chiefs advanced the date of the Leyte landing, then decided the issue MacArthur felt so strongly about. The Luzon-Formosa question was resolved, not on the basis of institutional loyalties, not on the morality of bypassing tortured prisoners, but on logistics.
One of the problems with invading Formosa is that it's logistically difficult. The Navy has moved across the Central Pacific rather rapidly, and in order to accumulate the men and material to invade Formosa would take too long. It would mean the Pacific War would have to stagnate for a couple of months, and no American military planner wants that. They want to keep the ball rolling. They want to continue to advance on Japan.
The Navy's success in the bitter rivalry helped to assure MacArthur's redemption. The Leyte invasion would mark the beginning of his liberation of the Philippines. He had long complained about a lack of shipping. No longer. Tell Arthur, he wrote his wife Jean from the cruiser Nashville, that we have more than 600 ships, and that as far as I can see in all directions, there are nothing but ships. With all love to you both, I'll be thinking of you tomorrow when I go in. On October 20th, MacArthur went ashore, the last four-star general to exercise command at the front. His 2.5-year quest was over.
People of the Philippines, I have returned. Rally to me. Let the indomitable spirit of Bataan and Corregidor lead on. Rise and strike. For future generations of your sons and daughters, strike. In the name of your sacred dead, strike. Let no heart be faint. Let every arm be steeled.
"10 days after the landing, a MacArthur communique said Leyte was secure. But the fighting, journalists noted, had hardly begun. The elections are coming up in a few days, a press officer explained. If MacArthur had made a deal to give FDR good news before the election, he delivered on that day.
Speaking of the glorious operations in the Philippines, I wonder whatever became of the suggestion made a few weeks ago that I had failed for political reasons to send enough forces or supplies to General MacArthur.
In December, Roosevelt promoted MacArthur and his other top generals and admirals to 5-star rank. Within days, Admiral Nimitz paid a visit.
MacArthur was there to greet us at the bottom of the gangway. And when he saw the 5-star, you could see this frown come in his face. And later on, I understood from his aide that he was furious that the Admiral had outshone him by having 5 stars on. And General MacArthur had his staff stay up all night, filing down Philippine 10-cent pieces to make 5 stars. Next morning at breakfast, he appeared with 5 stars.
In early January 1945, MacArthur headed for Luzon. As he passed Corregidor and Bataan, he remembered that black night 3 years gone, when I churned through these same waters with only the determination to return. I felt an indescribable sense of sorrow, of loneliness, and of solemn consecration. He headed for Manila, the city where his mother had died, where he had courted his wife, where his son had been born. In liberating the city he loved, he would help to destroy it.
More than 3 years have elapsed, years of earnest struggle and sacrifice, since I withdrew our forces and relations from this beautiful city, that its churches and cultural centers might be spared the violence of military ravage. The enemy would not have it so. By these ashes, he has wantonly fixed the future pattern of his own doom.
MacArthur could not finish this speech. He broke down and recited the Lord's Prayer.
If my father could have seen what happened in the Philippines, and if he could have known the atrocities that had been committed by the Japanese, it certainly would have broken his heart, as it did ours when we first came home. Manila was destroyed. There was nothing at all.
Only 1/3 of the men MacArthur left behind had survived the war. There were burial details every day. Here was all that was left of my men of Bataan and Corregidor, he wrote. I looked down the lines of men with suffering and torture written on their gaunt faces. Each man, barely speaking above a whisper, said, "You're back," or "You made it," or "God bless you." I could only reply, "I'm a little late, but we finally came." MacArthur had not seen his family for more than 4 months. On his 65th birthday in January, Jean wrote, "I send all my love to you, and may it help to form a mantle of protection for you. I love you more than you will ever know. May we be able to share in peace many more of your birthdays together. God bless you, Jeannie." In May, the Joint Chiefs put MacArthur in command of the invasion of Japan. His planning had barely begun when the war ended abruptly in August. The atomic bomb was developed by the Army, carried to a Pacific island by the Navy, dropped on Japan by the Air Force. MacArthur had nothing to do with it. He was indignant when he learned that General Eisenhower had known of the bomb before he was told. To reporter Theodore White, he said, "White, do you know what this means? Men like me are obsolete. There will be no more wars, White. No more wars." With World War II over, America's new president, Harry Truman, had to decide who would take the surrender and preside over the occupation of Japan. In his diary, he derided MacArthur as Dugout Doug, a stuffed shirt, Mr. Prima Donna, brass hat, 5-star MacArthur, but he needed him.
MacArthur was considered the Republican general in the Pacific, and he, Truman, had to appease Republican sentiment by appointing him. and Tokyo was far away. It was as far away from Washington as you could get, and that had certain political advantages.
MacArthur informed Truman he would take the surrender at the American embassy in Tokyo. Truman informed MacArthur he was sending the battleship Missouri. On the morning of September 2nd, 1945, nearly 260 warships lay at anchor in Tokyo Bay.
American ships, ships of the British fleet, and a few other ships from other nations were there as far as the eye could see, except for our aircraft carriers. They were offshore with destroyer screen, and our patrol planes were overhead. And we weren't taking any chances.
When I studied Japanese as a kid, one of the phrases in the school book was, "We, nation of 90 million, never once in battle defeated. Ruled over by a dynasty seated upon the throne since before the beginning of the memory of men." There was no defeat in Japanese history. He wanted to make sure the Japanese knew.
When the Germans surrendered to Eisenhower, the thing was done in the middle of the night. It was done more or less in private. MacArthur was not going to have anything like that. It would be a public ceremony. It would not be an exercise in triumphalism. It would be a quasi-religious experience bringing the slaughter to an end.
He held that surrender off until the 2nd of September so that the Chinese, the British, the Russians, the Filipinos, and other occupied peoples could appear in full uniform and participate. He understood the political importance of a grand ceremony. He also understood the political importance of announcing the peace would be generous.
We are gathered here, representatives of the major warring powers, to conclude a solemn agreement whereby peace may be restored.
If you look at the lineup of generals and admirals on the deck of the Missouri, these are men who had personal losses at the hands of the Japanese. What MacArthur did was to create a ceremony of victory, to show these men that they had achieved this marvelous success, but also to show them that there was a transition into a peacetime period when their behavior and their view of Japan was going to have to become quite different.
It is my earnest hope, and indeed the hope of all mankind, that from this solemn occasion a better world shall emerge out of the blood and carnage of the past, a world founded upon faith and understanding.
MacArthur conducted that ceremony with extreme dignity, with carefully chosen words, but at no point said anything that could be interpreted as gloating, interpreted as baiting a beaten enemy. I thought it was the most dramatic, most moving ceremony I've ever witnessed.
For me, who expected the worst humiliation, diplomat Toshikazu Kase remembered, this was a complete surprise. For the living heroes and dead martyrs of the war, this speech was a wreath of undying flowers. This narrow quarterdeck was now transformed into an altar of peace. On September 8, 1945, MacArthur arrived at the U.S. Embassy in Tokyo with a new title, SCAP, Supreme Commander Allied Powers, and a new challenge, rehabilitating and democratizing a country of 70 million people.
He had an enormous intellect, and he threw himself physically and emotionally into every problem, no matter how small it was. And he always sought perfection in everything.
I tried to remember the lessons my own father had taught me as military governor of the Philippines, MacArthur recalled. Arthur MacArthur, a successful reformer, had been removed after a bitter quarrel with Washington. The new Supreme Commander faced his tasks, assailed, he wrote, by the gravest misgivings. Jean's concerns were less complicated. She wanted Arthur to have a normal life in Tokyo. Sergeant, as his father called him, was 8 on his first birthday in Japan, but had no one to play with, except middle-aged generals. They let him win at musical chairs. Life improved when Charles Canada Jr. arrived, the son of the general's new physician.
He was very much a regular kid, but he had a kind of a presence about him that his father had. The kind of presence where you don't have to give a verbal command or demand attention. He would be able to mold the way things were going simply by being who he was.
The embassy was an oasis. Beyond its walls, Tokyo lay in ruins.
You could literally see almost all the way across the city from the firebombs. I mean, it was an empty city, a deserted city. And it was not an unusual case to have 40 or 50 people going through the trash trying to get the whatever food had been thrown away by the American troops. They were hungry.
The starvation concerned MacArthur. He rounded up millions of tons of food set aside for the invasion of Japan and began to feed the Japanese. When Congress balked, he said he would not treat the Japanese as they had his men on Bataan. Besides, he feared riots. "Give me bread," he cabled, "or give me bullets." American soldiers who had braced themselves for a harsh occupation were relieved that the Japanese cooperated.
They accepted the decision of the emperor that we were not to be harmed. And I never had one instance in which I felt apprehensive. Now, we carried arms, to be sure, and in the first 4 or 5 months when there was no lights in the city at all, it was somewhat apprehensive in terms of touring the city. But I never had an instance, and I always attributed that to the fact that at that time, the reverence for the emperor was so intense that they would not violate it.
MacArthur wanted to harness this loyalty to ensure a smooth occupation. To use Hirohito, the god emperor in whose name the Japanese had waged war, for his own ends.
The concept which was very explicit in the intelligence reports MacArthur was reading was drive a wedge between the emperor and the militarists. And we must say the militarists betrayed the emperor. You people now should throw allegiance to the emperor, and we can persuade him to be a leader of democracy.
But MacArthur feared his hands would be tied by America's allies, who wanted to try the emperor as a war criminal. Washington also had not ruled that out. The Japanese feared for their emperor and began to sanitize the record.
でこの期間中に日本の政府と軍は徹底して軍の
It was the beginning of the occupation. During that 2 weeks, the Japanese government and military had concentrated on destroying and hiding all important official records from MacArthur's headquarters that might cause the emperor to be implicated in war crimes.
GHQ に対して隠そうとしました。
As he approached the embassy to meet MacArthur, Hirohito did not know how much the general knew of his involvement in the war. How, after the bloody conquest of China, he had rewarded his military commanders. How he had known in detail of the plan to attack Pearl Harbor and not moved to stop it. He did not know if MacArthur knew that he could have prevented the execution of captured American pilots. He did not know if MacArthur knew that he had been informed of every kamikaze attack on American ships and had praised the pilots. The God Emperor had no inkling of his fate or that of his throne as he made the unprecedented move to call upon his conqueror.
MacArthur came towards the emperor and said, "Your Majesty, you are very welcome," and swept towards him and shook his hand, and the emperor's hand was shaking. And then MacArthur said, "Tell him that we're going to take one photograph."
That was a very shocking picture. There is MacArthur in an open shirt, as the Japanese press always says, no necktie. There is MacArthur with no necktie and towering over this little man who is the allegedly larger than life symbol of the Japanese Empire and the descendant of the sun goddess, looking meek and small.
So on one side, this is the great symbol for the Japanese that the emperor is no longer the supreme power in the land. But the other side of the picture is much more interesting, and that is, I'm standing by the emperor. This is the symbol that I will stand by you, and that I will indeed welcome your presence.
The two men then met alone with the emperor's interpreter. MacArthur wrote that the emperor said, "I come to you to bear sole responsibility for every action taken by my people in the conduct of the war."
I would not want to say that five-star General of the Army Douglas MacArthur told a prevarication. Maybe we could say he elaborated on the truth. I don't think the emperor said that I'm responsible and I accept the full blame for all that happened. I think MacArthur felt it would have been nice if the emperor did say it, and it'd be very nice for the outside world to think that he said it. And so MacArthur put those words into his mouth.
In fact, years later, it was discovered that the emperor's own interpreter had kept his account of the interview, and MacArthur does all the talking and tells him how he knows how he's fought for peace and how war is a terrible thing and how, he respects the emperor. And the emperor never makes any grand statement about accepting responsibility.
When the emperor departed, he was visibly more relaxed and said he hoped to see MacArthur many more times. Imperial censors then moved to prevent publication of the photograph. MacArthur overruled them. As nothing else could, a Japanese observer noted, this convinced a shocked nation that Japan was truly beaten. MacArthur then announced a program of sweeping reforms, implementing policies from Washington, initiating others, taking credit for them all. He abolished the secret police and insisted the press be free, but not to criticize him. He emancipated Japanese women. and liberalized education, demanding the study of democracy. He turned over land to the peasants who farmed it and encouraged laborers to unionize. He purged wartime leaders and released political prisoners, including hundreds of communists. MacArthur felt he was imposing America's Bill of Rights in a carefully controlled revolution. Japan's conservative government complained he was turning the country red. The Supreme Commander was in control, but not as much as he thought.
What happens a few months after this is an extraordinarily subtle choreography in which the imperial court begins to invite SCAP officials, top military and civilian people in the occupation command, to the imperial grounds to partake in imperial activities. And the one that the military men, the American military men, are so fascinated by is the imperial duck hunt.
I was handed this huge net that was bigger than I was, and I was led over to a water-filled channel where ducks were swimming, and I was told that I should reach in and scoop them up, and that was the whole idea of the game. So I thought that was wonderful. I'd never heard of anything like this before, and it was absolutely grand to be able to do it.
So there are all these top brass are running around waving their butterfly nets and getting imperial ducks. And there's no greater royalists in Japan than the Americans. They love this proximity to the throne. And in this way, they're kind of brought into this wonderful, gentle tradition. And it's brilliant. It's absolutely brilliant on the part of the Japanese side to say, you know, here's what we are, here's the court, and here's what we really are, a gentle people. It's like the chrysanthemum and the sword. We're really the chrysanthemum, the sword. That wasn't part of us.
While the palace courted MacArthur's entourage, he was working to ensure the emperor's survival before the formation of an Allied commission that might urge his indictment as a war criminal. In January 1946, he wired Eisenhower, then Army Chief of Staff, that after as complete a research as was possible, he could find no evidence the emperor was responsible for the war.
The cable said the material which could prove the emperor's responsibility for the war could not be found, and included the warning that if the emperor was to be indicted, the country will be in chaos. Except there are absolutely no records of MacArthur seriously searching for or gathering any material relating to the emperor and his war responsibilities.
MacArthur ordered his staff to draft a constitution in 1 week. He wanted to present the Allies with a new document protecting the civil liberties he had introduced and preserving an emperor stripped of power. When it was presented to Foreign Minister Yoshida Shigeru and the cabinet, they were stunned to discover the emperor had less power than a British monarch.
The Japanese, of course, wanted just the opposite. They wanted the emperor to be as strong as possible. And this is what caused so many hours of debate, because they looked at it from completely different points of view. And so they started arguing about every word. Where we wanted symbol of the state, which is a weak word, they wanted head of state. One of them said to one of the Japanese government officials, now, you know, General MacArthur actually would like to keep the emperor from being tried as a war criminal. It would help him a lot if you accepted the basic principles of this constitutional draft.
MacArthur presented another shocker. One of his earliest acts as Supreme Commander had been to disarm Japan. He now demanded a clause in the Constitution that would prevent Japan from ever waging war again.
Without MacArthur, there would never have been a line in the Constitution that says Japan, you know, outlaws war and the rights of belligerency of the state. These kind of things came from him. And it's quite a remarkable, grand accomplishment, because here is a man who has given his life to war, who comes in and says to them, war is horrendous and we cannot do it anymore, and you Japanese have the opportunity to be a pacifist state.
The government was terrified about what the emperor would think of MacArthur's constitution. Reluctantly, they presented it to the palace.
He's not happy with being an emperor and stripped of all political power, but he accepts the Constitution because this guarantees that whatever happens to him, the imperial house has been preserved.
Hirohito urged legislators to accept MacArthur's constitution, placing power in the hands of the people. He would now present himself, as MacArthur wanted to see him, as Japan's first Democrat. Conservative leaders felt the document had been rammed down their throats.
Of course, the Japanese government was horrified because this was, to them, unbelievably revolutionary. But that was the government. That was not the people. The people were very happy. They immediately rallied to protect the Constitution in every way.
No longer is the future to be settled by the few, MacArthur told the Japanese people as he urged them to vote for a new government. On April 10th, 1946, 3 out of 4 Japanese did vote, including 14 million women, for the first time. A vast majority of those they voted for were committed to the new constitution. Only 6 were wartime leaders. 5 were communists. And best of all, MacArthur said, there were 38 women. He had checkmated the Allies. They could not now undo reforms validated by popular vote. The Japanese knew they had a new ruler, and that the center of power had shifted. Each day they watched MacArthur come and go with reverent silence. You have a feeling, a reporter wrote, that people almost bow when they mention General MacArthur's name. MacArthur wanted to show that the Japanese people accepted their new democratic emperor.
They begin to have the emperor travel to different places in Japan and meet the people. The emperor has never mixed with the people.
On this precedent-shattering occasion, Hirohito conversed with many of his subjects, very different from the days when his people were even forbidden to look upon the sacred presence.
There was a wonderful line in the Japanese press. It says, the emperor came and talked. He didn't have much to say. He looked like someone who had just come out of a box. And his awkwardness often took the form of him saying, "Ah, so," which means, "Oh, is that so?" And this was the way he responded, and it became kind of a joke. And he's so sincere and awkward. It really conveys an image that he was indeed a man innocent of any war responsibility.
And when you come to the year 1947, the touring emperor's encounters with his people are more choreographed. And they become great events with tens and tens of thousands of people lining the streets and people waving the flag. And Americans watch this, foreigners watch this, and they say they have become victory tours.
The palace had once again parlayed a MacArthur initiative to its own advantage. It had turned the promotion of a democratic emperor into traditional emperor worship. MacArthur ordered the tours discontinued. In contrast to the emperor, the Supreme Commander's remoteness was becoming legendary. He vowed he would never break bread with the Japanese, and with an overwhelming workload, seldom socialized with anyone.
He would entertain at lunch, if he would entertain at all. He would be back at work at 5 p.m. And then the real work day started, and we would be there till maybe 9:30 p.m. if we were lucky. If there was a problem to be solved, he would want to solve it before he quit. This occurred 7 days a week. Christmas, New Year's, anniversary dates were not considered.
In 5 years, MacArthur saw nothing of the country he was trying to reform. Instead, he encouraged Jean to act as his eyes and ears. She traveled on the imperial train.
And when we get to a stop, they would roll out the red carpet, and the officials of the town would be there to greet us, and we would be treated literally like royalty. Every place we went, they tried to entertain us and amuse us, so there was never a dull moment.
For Charles and Arthur, the most exciting trip was to Mikimoto's pearl farm.
They took us out in boats, and we saw these young women diving for the oysters and bringing them up in their baskets. And then they had a special surprise when the meal was served. We opened the oysters and getting ready to eat them, but instead of the normal, what you'd expect to find inside an oyster, there'd be these beautiful big pearls. And Arthur and I fell to taking the pearls and playing marbles with them. Well, it took a few minutes for Mrs. MacArthur and my mother to realize what was going on, and they swooped down, scooped up the pearls, and took them away from us. Mrs. MacArthur said, "You're living through a very special time of your life. You must savor it, you must enjoy it, because in a certain number of years, we'll be going back to being ordinary mortals once we leave the occupation."
Despite MacArthur's protection, the emperor watched nervously as the Tokyo war crimes trials unfolded. MacArthur had encouraged the palace to finger the military leaders as the guilty ones. This tactic almost backfired. 28 war leaders were indicted. General Tojo topped the list. The palace had accused Tojo of abusing his power as prime minister to authorize the attack on Pearl Harbor.
At one moment, Tojo just frankly said, there's no way that we would have done anything against the emperor's wishes. And the prosecution and MacArthur's headquarters were so alarmed that they actually sent people in to Tojo to tell him to make sure he corrected that statement.
In a staged cross-examination, Tojo swore the emperor had always been a man of peace and never wanted war. The emperor survived. Tojo and 6 other loyal subjects were hanged. As the trials ended in 1948, members of the imperial court, knowing the throne was secure, wanted Hirohito to accept his responsibility for the war by abdicating.
MacArthur said, no, don't abdicate. And as a result of this, from the Japanese perspective, you have a man who becomes America's symbol of democracy, who is totally sanitized by the Americans, and by MacArthur in particular, from not even expressing real responsibility for decisions, but moral responsibility for the horrors that took place in his name. And I think that that poisoned the thinking about responsibility in general in Japan to the present day.
He didn't care about the emperor personally, except as a tool for his own magnification. MacArthur wanted the occupation to be his last shining, glorious hour.
In March 1947, MacArthur looked at Japan and was pleased. His land reform had ended what he called a system of virtual slavery and put 90% of the land in the hands of the farmers. Public health programs had saved millions of lives. The progress he had made transforming Japan in America's image was there for the world to see.
Children of occupation families and Japanese youngsters alike ride in the events. Young Arthur MacArthur uses the trick jumps to get some trick shots. The horses don't kick over the traces, but the Emperor's children certainly do. Hot dogs for their highnesses yet. The next thing, they'll be wearing bobby sogs.
I think for MacArthur, establishing a record of positive, liberal, reformist achievement in Japan was an important part of his political resurrection in the United States. It would make up for the lapses of the Bonus March. It would show people that he wasn't just a commander, he wasn't just a great general, but he was someone who could take a defeated nation, democratize it, make it better than it was, along an American model.
MacArthur feared a prolonged occupation could foster resentment. It was time, he said, to bring the troops home and sign a peace treaty. He planned to run for president in 1948 on his achievement in Japan.
He announces that everything is fine in Japan. The only thing that's wrong is the occupation's going on too long. The Americans can just go home. Peace has been achieved.
The general's announcement shocked Truman. In 1947, he looked at Japan and saw trouble. The post-war economy was in shambles. Business leaders who prospered during the war now had little incentive to rebuild. His own policy had been to purge them and dismantle their monopolies. Labor leaders, including communists, emboldened by MacArthur's reforms, threatened to shut the country down. Truman saw Japan weakened at a time when the Soviet Union was extending its power over Eastern Europe. And Mao Zedong's communists were sweeping across China. It was no time, Truman felt, to bring the troops home.
With the Cold War heating up, the Truman administration announced that the fundamental American security policy would be the containment of the Soviet Union through the rebuilding, what they called the two great workshops of Europe and Asia, Germany and Japan. That had dire implications for Douglas MacArthur and his occupation policy. It meant, first of all, there wouldn't be any quick end to the occupation because the American policy would now be to continue the occupation until economic stability had been achieved. The other thing it implied was that MacArthur had done something wrong.
Having taken credit for Washington's policies, he now took the blame. He was accused of making Japan vulnerable to communism. MacArthur felt he could control the communists. He also knew he had neither the time nor the money to rebuild the economy before the elections.
His Tokyo headquarters, General Douglas MacArthur announces that he will accept the presidency if called by the American people. The 68-year-old Pacific Supreme Commander adds, however, that he will not actively seek nomination.
The New York Times predicted a MacArthur victory in the Wisconsin primary.
maintained toward
One who worked with him wondered why.
sponsored by persons who believe him the strong.
He was 19th century. He wasn't 20th century. And he used such colorful words when he said, "Were I not to run for the presidency, I would be recreant to my duty." Who uses the word recreant? And everyone ran and looked it up in the dictionary.
In March 1948, on the eve of the Republican primaries, Truman dispatched Undersecretary of the Army William Draper to convince the general to follow Washington's new plans. MacArthur ignored him.
And MacArthur's view was, until he got an order from the Joint Chiefs of Staff to do this, he wasn't going to pay any attention to it. People in Washington could think this was a good idea, but he would only do what he thought was right to carry out the policies he previously had.
From his perspective, Washington's decision to reverse the policies that Washington had ordered him to implement, I think any human being would be resentful of that. But I do also think his memory of his father's difficulties, his father's sliding at the hands of Army bureaucrats and politicians in Washington, is a crucial factor in shaping his attitude.
MacArthur had many admirers in Tokyo. Unfortunately for him, their votes did not count. His dismal showing in Wisconsin, where he was considered a native son, effectively ended his campaign. After his defeat, an aide remarked, "The general is as low as a rug." With MacArthur no longer a political threat, Truman sent a Detroit banker, Joseph Dodge, to Tokyo with the title of Ambassador Extraordinary, so MacArthur could not ignore him. Dodge began to rebuild, not reform, Japan's economy, and help the old monopolies regroup. Japan's conservative leaders rejoiced. The emperor was also losing confidence in MacArthur. Because of the general's pacifist constitution, Hirohito feared for Japan's security and wanted U.S. troops to remain. He began to bypass MacArthur and develop direct access to Washington. In the late 1940s in Tokyo, General Douglas MacArthur found himself, as he had in the late 1930s in Manila, isolated from power. He was rescued once again by war. On June 25, 1950, communist North Korean troops attacked South Korea across the 38th parallel. The Korean War was underway. Truman committed U.S. forces. MacArthur would command them. When the United Nations joined the war, he became UN commander.
Harry Truman didn't like the kind of general MacArthur was. He saw him as a show-off. He didn't like the bravado, the theatrical kind of general that MacArthur was. But he certainly recognized MacArthur's ability.
At age 70, Douglas MacArthur was in a major war for the third time in his life. He rushed to the front all that he had, ill-equipped and out-of-shape occupation forces. They were no match for Soviet-built tanks and well-trained North Korean troops. Within a month, the U.S. 8th Army had retreated to a defensible line around the port of Pusan.
We were under strength, we were under equipped, we were really struggling to hang on for our lives. But we just had this feeling that MacArthur back in Tokyo, he knows what's happening and somehow he's going to do something to help.
Before MacArthur could rescue his entrapped army, he got embroiled in an argument with Truman that almost cost him his job. When Chinese nationalists, America's World War II allies, lost the Civil War, they fled to the island of Formosa, later called Taiwan. MacArthur was dismayed when Truman said the U.S. would not defend Formosa. When the Korean War broke out, Truman wanted to defend Formosa, but without provoking the communists. He sent veteran diplomat Averell Harriman to Tokyo to make sure MacArthur understood. MacArthur did, Harriman told Truman, but without full conviction. He told a diplomat in Tokyo that one of these days he intended to blast Truman's State Department wide open.
He regarded the people in Washington as very timorous and very unable to reach decisions. And he felt that Washington needed a decision, and he knew no one better than he who could provide better decisions than MacArthur. This is MacArthur.
MacArthur tried to nudge Truman toward an aggressive defense of Formosa in a letter to a veterans group. Truman was livid at MacArthur's meddling in policy and considered firing him. But he backed off. It was a critical moment in the war. MacArthur was about to embark on a bold plan to free his beleaguered army. He would land behind enemy lines at the port of Incheon and cut North Korea's supply lines. The 8th Army could then break out of its enclave around Pusan. When Harriman was in Tokyo, MacArthur had asked him for the forces he would need.
MacArthur said to Harriman, "I cannot believe that a great nation like the United States cannot give me these few paltry reinforcements for which I ask. Tell the President that if he gives them to me, I will land at Incheon on the rising tide at daybreak on the 15th of September, and between the hammer of this landing and the anvil of the 8th Army, I will shatter and destroy the armies of North Korea."
The Joint Chiefs were nervous about the plan. They flew to Tokyo to express their concerns.
The chiefs all had their say. And at the end, MacArthur took that corncob pipe out of his mouth and clanked it into the ashtray, stood up, and he said, "Gentlemen, I will be landing in Incheon this September, or you will have another commander."
On the same day, August 23rd, China's Chairman Mao studied a military assessment of MacArthur. It stressed his genius and his arrogance.
Mao say, okay, was he arrogant, stubborn? That's fine. The more arrogant, the more stubborn he is, the better, because an arrogant and stubborn enemy is easy to defeat.
On September 13th, 1950, MacArthur's armada headed for the port of Incheon. With its narrow channel and mud. That is what worried the Joint Chiefs. At low tide, the harbor is a mudflat. 3 miles of mudflat. A landing force would be stranded for almost 12 hours until the next high tide. It was a risky but unlikely place for a landing. As in World War II, he would hit them where they ain't. Despite his confidence, he confessed to an aide the plan was a tremendous gamble. He headed for shore, a destroyer captain observed, in a Napoleonic pose. He was nauseous when he got there.
And we thought, how in the world did he manage to gather together a force? And it was a real lifting of our spirits down south, and of course that broke the pressure, and we were able to then to start driving north. And it was just the greatest feeling that suddenly the tide had turned, and when we had been just days before fighting for our lives.
Chairman of the Joint Chiefs Omar Bradley called the landing a dazzling victory. MacArthur's forces recaptured South Korea's capital, Seoul, within days. Then headed north for the 38th parallel. The UN's original mandate was to restore South Korea. Now it became reunify Korea, provided there was no major Soviet or Chinese intervention. MacArthur crossed the 38th parallel.
And Truman supported. They were, as we would say, pumped up. They were excited. Victory was very close. It was standard military doctrine that you chase and destroy the enemy's army. And that's what they were going to do, and they crossed that parallel.
MacArthur was told that only South Korean troops could approach the Yalu River, the border with China. He bridled at such interference from Washington. MacArthur spat blood at Secretary of State Dean Acheson, a British diplomat wired London.
Not only they crossed the 38th parallel, they were marching toward the Chinese-Korean border. Who should believe, who can believe that they would stop at the Chinese-Korean border?
The day after UN forces crossed into North Korea, Truman requested a meeting with MacArthur.
MacArthur said it's very important. It's a very crucial stage of the war, and I don't want to go that far away. So Truman offered to go halfway, and someone brought up Wake Island, which is much more than halfway, which is about 2/3 of the way.
Truman, I think, surely knew that MacArthur looked down at him. MacArthur looked down just about everybody, but particularly Harry Truman, who he saw as this reserve captain from World War I and a little small-time politician. What did he know?
I have a whale of a job before me, Truman wrote from the plane. Have to talk to God's right-hand man tomorrow. In 1944, FDR had met the hero of the Pacific several months before presidential elections. Truman would meet the hero of Incheon just weeks before congressional elections.
MacArthur was at the foot of the ramp waiting for Truman when he came down.
And when Mr. Truman stepped on the ground, MacArthur shook hands with him very effusively, as did Truman. I did notice that he had not saluted him, which struck me as somewhat odd.
But he didn't do it. No, he didn't salute his commander-in-chief, and Harry Truman noticed that.
I don't think it was intended as disrespectful. I think he never saluted first. Everybody always saluted him, so he returned the salute. But he was not in the habit of saluting first. There was nobody to salute, not the emperor, not anybody. And then they got in a vehicle.
One Secret Service agent remembered the two chatted without rancor. Another claimed Truman bawled out MacArthur. I'm the commander-in-chief, you're just a general. Remember that. Why do you insist on going into China? We don't want to do that. The general session took place in a communications shack.
And President Truman said, General MacArthur, I'm very concerned with the Chinese massing troops along the border. Do you think they will intervene? To which the reply was, Mr. President, this is not the hour of our weakness. This is the hour of our strength. If the Chinese cross the Yalu, I will make of them the greatest slaughter in the history of warfare. They have no means for giving ground air support to the ground troops, and they cannot do it, and I do not believe they will.
MacArthur had a reasonable estimation that a Chinese army crossing the Yalu might be poorly commanded, although skilled in guerrilla warfare, would not be skilled against American air, against American heavy artillery concentrations, against American armor, and against American tactical infantry.
And of course, one has to remember the psychology of it. He's a victorious general. He's just reversed the tide of the war. The force is with him in a way. And he believed that it would continue if only you persisted just a little bit longer.
President Truman asked General MacArthur when he thought the war would be over. General MacArthur replied that he didn't know, but he thought it would be over by Christmas, and that he would be able to give 2 divisions for NATO in Europe in the beginning of the new year.
Truman very understandably accepts that, believes it. Why shouldn't he? And MacArthur believed it. It wasn't MacArthur was trying to pull something over the president's head or to speak irresponsibly.
The Chinese troops which crossed Yalu in October were the best units of the People's Liberation Army, but they were under the name of the Chinese People's Volunteers. Mao believed that this would reduce the possibility of a formal war between China and the United States.
On October 24th, 1950, MacArthur ordered his commanders to drive forward with all speed for the Yalu River.
As we were moving north towards the Yalu, we began to confront organized units of regular Chinese forces. And we would immediately report that back to Tokyo, and we would be reassured that no, this was not that at all. These were volunteers, and they were token volunteers, and they shouldn't disconcert us too much.
MacArthur ordered an air campaign to lay waste the Korean side of the Yalu River. The Chinese, it seemed, were a threat. Fearing a wider war, Truman began to rein in his commander. He prohibited airstrikes within 5 miles of the border unless MacArthur's forces were in immediate danger. The hero of Incheon said they were in danger. On the eve of the congressional elections, he threatened to hold Truman responsible for American blood that would flow from every hour of delay. Washington relented. The Air Force began to encounter Soviet MiG fighters based in China. MacArthur wanted to chase them into China and destroy their bases. Truman again said no, and considered stopping UN troops well short of the Yalu River. MacArthur had successfully badgered Washington in World War II. I recommend with all the earnestness I possess, his cable now read, that we press on to complete victory. Once again, MacArthur got his way. After 2 weeks, the Chinese attacks suddenly stopped. The lull in the battle was reassuring.
This Thanksgiving Day was sparkled with rumors of possible peace in Korea. There are a certain number of facts behind the rumors. There has been the unexplained withdrawal of the Chinese troops. UN forces advanced anywhere from
The 8th Army headed for the Yalu. On the other side of what MacArthur thought were impenetrable mountains, the Marines headed for a reservoir they called Frozen Chosen.
At this point, the Chinese were playing with MacArthur's arrogance by creating a kind of image that the UN forces under MacArthur's command was winning a military victory. Actually, the Chinese troops were preparing some deadly traps for MacArthur's forces.
MacArthur flew to the front to witness the final offensive. His communique that day read, "This should, for all practical purposes, end the war." On November 26th, more than 300,000 Chinese and North Korean troops streamed out of the mountains and fell upon the UN forces.
When we got to the Yalu River, sure enough, we found, like Custer, where did all these Chinese come from? The hills were black with these people. I've never seen so many people in all my life. It was a very frightening experience.
The entire UN front was in disarray. Douglas MacArthur faced his biggest defeat since his forces surrendered on Bataan almost 9 years before. Once again, he felt it personally.
MacArthur had a very keen feeling for the West Point graduates. Their attrition rate was astonishing. About a third of the class, I think, of 1950 was killed in that conflict. He would always ask me, what about Trent? What about Tom Lombardo? These were company commanders and platoon leaders that were great Army football players at West Point. And I knew when I'd have to tell him that, well, Tom was killed today, he would get tears in his eyes and have to go back to his office and then resume the briefing later.
Arthur was almost 13 that Christmas of 1950. He would have known how much his father revered West Point, how much his father looked forward to his being sworn in as a cadet. He would have known that he had been named for a grandfather who had been the highest-ranking officer in the U.S. Army. His father had encouraged him in riding lessons, his mother in music lessons, which he preferred. That Christmas, he gave one of his concerts, which included compositions of his own. As usual, the embassy staff and their families attended, as did his father.
I never thought about the fact that the general had all these incredible demands on his time, but he never missed one. He would make time, no matter how late it was at night. He would come in and tuck us in and talk to us about how our day had gone. And I think those visits in the evening, even though it might be late, made up for a lot. We'd tell him these trivial things that we had done, and whether we'd had a Cub Scout meeting, whether we'd played cowboys and Indians. It didn't make any difference how inconsequential it would be in the grand scheme of things. He wanted to hear it.
MacArthur spared Arthur the strains he was under, but not Jean. "I feel as if the walls are closing in on me," she confided to a friend. It seemed that she was likely to collapse, her friend wrote. She lost weight, she couldn't sleep. She picked at her food. She suffered for her husband. He was flying to Korea more often and working longer hours. As 1951 began, Douglas MacArthur, almost 71, was fighting the battle of his life. After the Chinese offensive in late November, his forces began a 300-mile retreat, the longest in U.S. military history. He asked Washington for reinforcements. He wanted to use Chinese troops from Formosa in Korea and on the Chinese mainland. He wanted to blockade China's ports and bomb its industrial base. Truman refused all of this. He decided not to expand the war.
I think it was one of the most important decisions of the whole Truman second term. They decided what was going to be the policy from then on, a limited war, because they're deathly afraid, understandably and rightly, of this flaring up into a world war. And by then, of course, the Soviet Union had the atomic bomb.
MacArthur told the press the restrictions on him were a handicap without precedent in military history. General MacArthur, as usual, has been shooting off his mouth, Truman wrote in his diary.
The more people that President Truman sent out from Washington to talk to General MacArthur, the more General MacArthur became convinced that Washington didn't have an end plan, an end game, that its sense of how to end the war simply wasn't clear enough to provide the direction a military man needed to conduct the war.
MacArthur threatened Washington with a dire choice. His forces, which had retreated below the 38th parallel, faced annihilation or evacuation to Japan unless he could expand the war. He had a new field commander in 1951, General Matthew Ridgway. Ridgway was more optimistic. He accepted Washington's restrictions, rallied the troops, and headed north.
Ridgway took hold of the 8th Army, grabbed it by the throat, gave it a good shake, and straightened it out. He reformed a line across the peninsula, one coast to the other. And then he began a deliberate, buttoned-up offensive, a step at a time. Good artillery support, good air support. Identify your objectives and take them.
Ridgway exposed as false MacArthur's choice of annihilation or evacuation. The Pentagon began to look to him for military assessments, to regard MacArthur as a prima donna figurehead who had to be tolerated. In February, Ridgway ordered a big offensive toward Seoul. MacArthur told reporters he had ordered the offensive. Ridgway saw this as an unwelcome reminder of MacArthur's need to keep his public image always glowing. In March, the 8th Army, under Ridgway, recaptured Seoul. Then headed for the 38th parallel. For Truman and the Allies, that was enough. They would go no farther north. They settled for the UN's original mandate, restoring South Korea. Truman prepared to make a ceasefire offer to China.
General MacArthur faced the prospect. Politicians have decided to end the war in a position where militarily we are not necessarily where we would like to be. How is this going to happen? What should we do?
Just recapturing Seoul and moving back and getting back to the 38th parallel does not remove the military threat to South Korea.
In Tokyo, one observer found MacArthur tired and depressed. In Korea, another thought he was exhausted, a beaten man. He had been humiliated by the Chinese, proved wrong by Ridgway, marginalized by the Pentagon. And now Truman wanted to sue for peace, to thwart an expanded war with China, which he, MacArthur, would direct from Tokyo. Perhaps this realization, General Bradley wrote, snapped his brilliant but brittle mind. Others felt he responded not with a cracked but a calculating mind. One was a longtime aide, General Courtney Whitney.
It is the assessment of General Whitney that General MacArthur felt this was the time to leave the service because he felt so strongly about the issue. And what was the issue? The issue was winning the war.
MacArthur went public, and he practically forced Truman to relieve him.
MacArthur went public with his own peace proposal. He threatened China with imminent destruction, then envisioned a peace that suggested a settlement at the Yalu. But not by diplomats. MacArthur himself would meet the Chinese commander in the field, as great men did in centuries past. Truman viewed MacArthur's statement as premeditated sabotage and decided to fire him when the time was right. He would not have to wait long. 2 weeks later, House Minority Leader Joseph Martin made public a letter from MacArthur endorsing Martin's desire to use troops from Formosa. There is, MacArthur warned, no substitute for victory. He wanted to win, as he had won in 2 world wars. He worried that fighting at an indefensible line could be endless. What he feared is what happened. The war, then 9 months old, would continue as a stalemate for more than 2 years. America would suffer another 50,000 casualties. MacArthur's quarrel with Truman was about more than the goals of the war. It was about who should be in charge. His father had told him he must do what was right for his country, no matter what the personal sacrifice might be.
Blind loyalty to a commander of a unit or even a president must be overwhelmed by one's subjective perception of the best interest of the people. And I think MacArthur was driven by that. I happen to think it's the right solution. It can be very costly to an individual.
He was forgetting what he had learned at West Point, that the commander-in-chief is the supreme commander. And he told Samuel Eliot Morison, the historian, that he didn't agree with that. He thought that in the field, the general should decide. That only he knew the situation. And when Morison seemed a little surprised, he said it a second time, just to be sure that Morison knew that he wasn't being misquoted.
For Truman, the letter to Congressman Martin was the last straw. When he got word MacArthur might resign, he was heard to say, "The son of a bitch isn't going to resign on me. He's going to be fired."
I considered it essential to relieve General MacArthur so that there would be no doubt or confusion as to the real purpose and aim of our policy.
The group of us were sitting around the embassy, and the announcement came. All our lives as we know it had just ended, and the overall atmosphere was one of stunned silence for the longest period of time. And I think the general must have summoned up every bit of stoicism that he possessed, because he didn't react at all.
Jean had often told Arthur their privileged life would someday end, and they would be mortals once again. As MacArthur lost his supreme command, his former aide Dwight Eisenhower assumed one, at NATO. Vernon Walters was with him in Germany when a reporter broke the news.
He said, "General Eisenhower, the president has just fired General MacArthur for insubordination. Do you have any comment?" And Eisenhower smiled a strange smile. And then he said, "Well, you know, when you put on a uniform, you impose certain restrictions on yourself as to what you can do and say."
In Tokyo, the emperor called upon MacArthur one last time. He overruled his advisors, who said an emperor never visits a person without rank, as MacArthur now was. For the first time, MacArthur walked the emperor to his car. Ordinary Japanese were in shock. We feel as if we have lost a kind and loving father, a Tokyo paper wrote.
He had become, I wouldn't say beloved perhaps, but highly respected by the Japanese, and they were sorry to see him go. And the streets were lined with people, 5 and 6 deep.
The Japanese did not believe anyone was in a position to fire MacArthur. His dismissal, a Japanese scholar argued, was the best lesson in democracy Japan ever had.
General MacArthur was wearing that same old Philippine Army Field Marshal's cap. When he got to the top of the stairs, he turned, and you'd think he was a conquering hero. Not at all the demeanor of a man who'd just been fired. And he entered the airplane with his farewell.
MacArthur had planned a leisurely trip home by boat until Republicans urged him to rush back and address a joint session of Congress.
I have just left your fighting sons in Korea. It was my constant effort to end this savage conflict honorably and with the least loss of time and a minimum sacrifice of life. Its growing bloodshed has caused me the deepest anguish and anxiety. Those gallant men will remain often in my thoughts and in my prayers always.
MacArthur's reception in Manhattan the next day was the greatest in U.S. history. It far surpassed Eisenhower's in 1945. Mail that flooded Congress was overwhelmingly against Truman. Nothing, historians have noted, had so stirred the political passions of the country since the Civil War. MacArthur testified for 3 days in Senate hearings. He belittled the risks of a wider war. Had one occurred, he said, the responsibility would have rested with Washington, not with him. He seemed, a senator noted, to be making Truman's case. He told Congress that George Marshall and the Joint Chiefs supported his strategy. When they denied this, support for the old soldier in Congress began to fade. For a year, he toured the country giving speeches.
The policies of appeasement on which we are now embarked carry within themselves the very incitation to war against us. Never before has a soldier been called to a rostrum such as this?
By the time he got to the 1952 Republican Convention, popular support for his risky win-the-war program had faded. Another five-star general was the main event.
MacArthur's reaction to news of Eisenhower's nomination was one of complete contempt. He did not believe for a moment that someone who had once been his subordinate could possibly discharge a responsibility that he himself had been denied.
Shortly after he returned, the general took Arthur to West Point. The uniform did not appear to fit. As a youngster, MacArthur wrote the football coach, Arthur saw more of war and death than many soldiers. I have wondered whether it has left a scar on him. After he graduated from school in New York, Arthur went to Columbia and studied literature, opera, and the theater.
He didn't care anything about shooting in war and didn't want any part of it. He didn't want to be a hero. He wanted to play the piano, possibly act. Those are the things that interested him.
His father had spent a lifetime seeking publicity. Arthur has sought to avoid it. The MacArthurs moved into the Waldorf Towers in New York and became a magnet for world leaders. When she was on her own, Jean continued to keep the general's flame alive. She stopped seeing visitors in 1997, at age 98.
It was only a couple years before his death. It was at a New York hotel, and I happened to be invited to this luncheon. And suddenly I looked down the corridor, and I saw here came General MacArthur, and he looked at me, and I guess he noticed the combat infantry badge and the Purple Heart and the Silver Star, and certainly he noticed the Korean Service Medal. And instead of just walking on past, he put out his hands and took hold of my shoulders and just shook them. And God, even today, I get chills when I think of that. And that's the magic of MacArthur.
Today marks my final roll call with you. But I want you to know my last conscious thoughts will be of the Corps and the Corps and the Corps.
MacArthur died at age 84, 2 years after his last visit to his beloved West Point. For 5 days, tens of thousands of mourners paid tribute. Eisenhower and Truman were not among them. Prime Minister Yoshida of Japan was.
4 great people in Asia consider him an immense national hero. It's an extraordinary thing for an American. It was a life enormously well led. He got up in the morning trying to do good for his country. He took the notions of honor and duty seriously.
One colleague during the Pacific War described him as someone who combined a sense of courage, vanity, ego, insight. But his greatest fault, he said, was someone who mistook his emotions and ambitions for principles, and he could never distinguish between the two.
MacArthur had had time to think about where he would be buried. West Point was special to him. He would be there, in time, at the edge of the plain. Across from the best clerk he ever had, Ike, who never led a charge. pleased, no doubt, that he occupied more real estate than Eisenhower, acknowledging, perhaps, the prominence accorded Washington. There was room at West Point, next to the son of President Ulysses S. Grant. But for Douglas MacArthur, sons of presidents was not presidential enough. He accepted a site that gave him the equivalent of a presidential library, with a museum, an archive, a gift shop, and a splendid place to rest, with room for Jean beside him. Douglas MacArthur was buried as he was born, to the sound of bugles. His funeral was replete with all the ceremony that he had come to cherish as a boy at the Army post at Fort Selden, New Mexico. Unlike his father, he was buried in his Army uniform. On April 11, 1964, one of the greatest soldiers in the history of the United States Army was buried in Norfolk, Virginia, a Navy town.
American Experience is made possible by the Alfred P. Sloan Foundation to enhance public understanding of the role of technology. The foundation also seeks to portray the lives of the men and women engaged in scientific and technological pursuit.
Liberty Mutual Insurance is a proud supporter of the American Experience. And by helping people live safer, more secure lives, we're also proud supporters of the American dream.
At the Scotts Company, we help make gardens more beautiful, lawns greener, trees taller. If there's a better business to be in, please let us know.
This program has been made possible by a grant from the National Endowment for the Humanities.
American Experience is also made possible by the Corporation